get that most of you are probably already sick and tired of hearing about this topic since there are so many people out there already covering it. But as someone who works in the Japanese game industry, this is a matter that hits a little closer to my heart. Or I guess to my boomer wallet, since back in the day I actually did work in Koei Tecmo when the Koei Tecmo Capcom patent case was still very fresh, and so I got to witness firsthand the level of paranoia that just hits the upper management when a case like this just suddenly drops. That said, I'm not gonna bore you again and like recount everything that's happened with this case. I'm sure you can find like plenty of people who have already talked about it, from lawyers to people who spend most of their time terminally on the internet, kind of like what I'm doing right now, I guess. But for those of you who live under a rock and who don't have the IQ of a starfish, to put it very simply, Nintendo sued the developers of Palworld Pocket Pair. But that's it. One thing that was not mentioned at all when the case was initially brought and has only come to light very recently are the patents that are involved in this patent lawsuit between Nintendo and Pocket Pair. Up till now, or at least I guess up till like a week or two ago, most people were mostly just making speculations on whether it was going to be this or that. But now we know for sure what the patents are, and there are 3 of them that are involved in this case. So first and foremost, the patents that were involved in this case were both surprising in a way and not so surprising at the same time. One thing that a lot of people seem to be getting wrong, or seem to get wrong prior to this point, is the fact that these aren't like freshly baked patents, like right out of the oven or something. These are all patents that, while they were registered very recently, they are all patents that are basically an alteration of patents that have pre-existed far beyond when this case initially came out. So, like for example, the one where you basically play with balls, that one was from 2021, and they basically altered and filed an alteration this year and had it registered, and they're using that as the basis for this lawsuit. Now, this action in and of itself is not something that's wholly new. Okay, Nintendo didn't come up with some new scummy tactic to try and like fuck with people or something. Okay, Nintendo, I'm not accusing you of being newly wholly evil. Don't send the ninjas after me. Rather, this is something that has been used within the industry for quite a while now. They used a similar tactic during the Nintendo Kodopara case a few years back, and this is basically how many companies go about preparing for one of these lawsuits. Essentially, rather than just taking the original system, which might be kind of different from what is within these games, they're basically taking that, proposing an alteration or an additional form of interpretation of the original patent, and then they're using this that actually gets approved by the patent office to then make the case that this original patent, by virtue of this new alteration of it, is what they're basing the lawsuit off of. So yes, the lawsuit patents are all registered this year, but what is important to note here is that all of them were from years before. That said, what was surprising was just the fact that there were only 3 patents involved in this case. Now, some of you might look at the number and go like, oh, isn't that quite a lot already? Like, yeah, that's a lot of patents to be suing someone over. But the thing you have to understand with this is that usually when a company sues in this kind of manner, it is with some bigger macro goal in mind. Yes, in the case of Koei and Capcom, they were suing over whose specific patent for a system was the more valid one and the other got invalidated. But typically, unless it's a specific case like that, you would see that in most cases, a company will bring forth a slew of patents to try and bring down a specific title, or in some cases even a series of titles from a company, because they feel that these games are infringing on multiple of their patents, and either those games need to pay them a huge amount of compensation and also alter their systems, or they need to shut down. And the reason why companies bring so many patents into a case is typically because they want to ensure that they can win the case itself, which is brought forth with the goal of hitting something that is more than just a specific patent. And so bringing up multiple patents reinforces the strength of their claim that this game is infringing on their thing instead. Because you have to understand that with patents, typically the patents that you can apply for and that do get approved tend to have to be very specific. And as a result, they also tend to be interpreted fairly narrowly. For example, if you were to look at this specific case, at the one about the playing with balls and like catching Lego cockfighting monsters and all of that. In the case of patent 7528390 that we're talking about here, there are 16 different points brought up to specify the scope of the patent and the type of actions that need to be performed under this scope. And when it comes to the final details of the patent, there are 236 points brought up to basically flesh it out. Most patents have to go into such detail because typically if they do not, the patent tends to just get rejected instead. And the reason for this is simply because when it comes to many of these patents, because they are patenting a system on its own, something that can be fairly generic, like a Spark system or a Pity system in a gacha game, for example, the patent office tends to require you to be very specific with it, or it would just be considered to be too general and therefore something that cannot be patented instead. And as a result, trying to bring just one patent to say that this game is infringing on your thing is a very risky move, because once again, when you're going into a lawsuit like this, you're investing a lot of money in to try and get them to pay you something. But if you're only bringing out one singular patent, it is a lot harder to show that what this company did might have been willful. And if the single patent itself, because of how many steps are required in its explanation and in its details, just falls through, your entire case would just fall through as well. One other thing that was kind of interesting in this case is that we also got to see the amount of money that Nintendo was expecting in compensation from Pocket Pair, which I think amounted to about 5 million yen each to Nintendo and to the Pokemon companies, to a total of 10 million, with potential for late charges, like waiting for the lawsuit, I'm supposed. So the thing with this is that, yeah, 10 million yen, it does sound like a lot, but we have to understand that when you compare this to the scale of most of these other patent lawsuits, this is a very minuscule amount. This is a drop in the piss bucket that is the shitstorm that is all of these patent lawsuits in the Japanese game industry. When you look at the Cygames Konami case, that amounted to 4 billion yen. The one with BOI and Sega was 1 billion. And even with the case where Nintendo actually sued Koropra, they actually settled for about 3.3 billion in yen. $3.3 billion yen being $30 million. Holy shit, those were the days, huh? Yeah, I guess I really am growing a little old. So we're talking about an amount that presently doesn't even reach the first decimal point of most of the other lawsuits we have seen. So why is Nintendo doing this? Well, the observations within the industry is that this is most likely because of the fact that Nintendo is suing mostly based off of these new alterations of the original patents that they have made in the past. And because all of these new alterations are registered fairly recently, the amount of damages that they can claim can only be for the period between when the patent got registered till the current day, if they, assuming they actually win this case. And so they probably kept the amount extremely small because of this very short frame, and this is likely to make this entire case therefore admissible in court as well. So no, this is not just because Nintendo wants this case to be used as an example to spite the company or something. There is an actual legal reason why they are likely keeping the amount small, and we're likely to see that the late charges that have not been stated now are going to be the part that balloons the longer this case tracks on for, and may actually even overshadow the original requested amount depending on how long the proceedings go on. That said, the thing is that in the end, all of this is likely to be something that the courts will have to decide in the end, and depending on how they go about with it, they might very well set new precedents that could shift how all of these patents are even interpreted in the first place. With the case of Koropra as well, there were people who were worried that because of how this patents, like if Nintendo won that case, the patent that they held for the Nintendo 3DS would therefore apply to mobile games, and that would actually expand the patent into becoming a blanket patent with a much bigger range of companies that it could then hit in the future. That said though, more importantly, Nintendo doesn't even really have to win this case. Because you see, the thing with most of these patent lawsuits is that they tend to last for a very long time, mostly between like 3 to maybe even 5 years. And while some cases like Capcom and Koei do reach a logical conclusion at the end, that one took like 5 years, I believe, there are cases that simply do not, just like the one between Nintendo and Koropra, where they just settled for 3.3 billion. And the reason for this is that these lawsuits, they are very expensive, and it can inhibit the financial operations of a company itself. Yet all of the companies that we have talked about to this point are all very massive companies that well, very successful, earning a lot of money. Even though they take a fairly massive financial hit in all of this, these are companies that can actually afford to take the hit. With the case of Palworld, it's not so much that they made this super revolutionary game, it's more so that they just made this game that had the haha funny meme shock value, and that was enough to basically capture enough of the attention of the gaming space in general, which, good for them. They even managed to get investor money to try to bring these games to the console. But the thing with all of this is that in the end, this is a company that doesn't have the war chest that many of these other companies have, especially when you compare them to something like Nintendo, for example. Frankly, when a case like this comes out, I don't think any company within the Japanese game industry is gonna take Pocket Pair's side. Like, at this point, like, most of the people I've spoken to, like, everybody has, for like the last 7-8 months, just been wondering, like, oh, when is the Pocket Pair loss gonna happen? Like, everyone was still waiting for this day to happen, because that was how sure everyone was that Nintendo would eventually do something. As I mentioned in the Sega BOI case, and I'm sorry to those who watched that video to like labor this point, you can skip to the next chapter of this video if you want, but I feel like I really just need to explain for those people for whom this is like the first video on this channel they're watching, that these cases are important because Japan really doesn't afford any form of protection to smaller like game firms that are being sued by all of these massive firms over all of these patent issues, right? Most medium to small firms and indie groups do not have the ability to play this patent game the same way that the AAAs do. And for the longest of times, a lot of this has been running on goodwill, where basically the big firms have just chosen to like leave the smaller firms alone and choose to not fuck over the little guy, because obviously doing so would harm innovation in the industry as a whole. When you look at the financial amounts that both BOI as well as Pocket Pair earn, they aren't like small indie firms anymore. But that said, they aren't on the level of your AAAs either. They are still firms that have like 100 plus, maybe 200 plus in staff, as compared to the thousands that are like being employed in many of these bigger firms. Yeah, they're not a small firm, but the fact that you can actually target firms of this size who likely do not have a legal department of the size of most of these other big firms, and who therefore may not even have the expertise required to check through all of these patents. Yeah, Nintendo, Sega, all these big firms, they do have the legal right to enforce these patents. I mean, that's why they are spending all of this money investing into registering these patents, right? So that they can enforce them when needed to protect their waifu gacha system that clearly is very different from everyone else's, I suppose. But even if you're a Nintendo fan or a Sega fan, like, more power to you, but you have to admit that it does set a precedent that is not good for the industry as a whole, because even if you feel that Nintendo and Sega are specifically justified in their specific cases, the precedent set by this case is basically gonna give firms that are more malicious than them a feeling that, yeah, now we could also do the same thing to firms that are much smaller, because we just want to ensure that we can stay on the top, and we'll just push everyone else below us down instead. That's it. One thing that did surprise me though is the fact that it does seem like, especially after the Sega BOI case and coming into this case right after, it does seem like there is a slowly growing number of people within Japan who have also begun to wake up to the idea of actually how damaging these patents could potentially be. I mean, yes, especially when the Palworld Nintendo case was first announced, there were many people who were actually quite against Pocket Pair, who actually just really wanted to see them fail and get the shit bit out of them by Nintendo, which, fair enough, when you look at a lot of the interviews the team gave, they kind of did come off like dicks, so I can kind of get why people really just didn't like them in general. And seeing them like openly talk about having like copied Pokemon's game and just to like make a quick buck probably like struck a nerve with a lot of people. But as people have seen what Sega has done in the previous case, and as they have seen how Nintendo has approached trying to hit this case in terms of with the patents, it does seem that a lot of people are starting to catch on to the fact that these may not actually be good things as well. In fact, there were actually some people I saw commenting about this who were actually pointing out that this patents, like exactly what I'm saying, that they might actually be damaging to innovation within the industry going forward. And it's kind of nice to see that this sentiment is slowly growing. Like, yes, there is still like probably more than 50% of people who still seem to be very supportive of Nintendo, but this shift, in my opinion, is important just simply due to the fact that the more this kind of sentiment start to spread and more people start to talk about it, it might also lead to, in the future, some of the online like game magazines or even in the actual news itself, since a lot of them do follow a lot of these big cases, it might actually lead to them also eventually starting to question whether or not all of this is a good thing for the industry. Like, people here are also keenly aware that the industry overall is also starting to deteriorate, and people have also been starting to question what could the potential reasons for all of this be. Why are we starting to see more and more like Korean and Chinese game ads popping up in Japan? Why are they starting to also hit the top of the sales chart? A lot of people have been looking for answers for that, and it does seem like people are slowly arriving at, well, I mean, this isn't the only conclusion, but one of the many reasons that all of this is even happening in the first place. And I feel like this is a very important first step. You could say it's a little slow, maybe even like 20 years too slow perhaps, but the fact that we're slowly starting to see progress as a result of all of the, well, I guess the mismanagement in this case of how they decided to handle the case with Pocket Pair, in my opinion, is hopefully going to at least lead in a more positive direction for the industry if people start to catch on more as to why this is a problem before these companies can come in, as in not necessarily the two of them, but the even bigger bag actors in the industry catch onto this and start to try to use this to apply pressure on the smaller companies. Because remember, people like to talk about how this is just two isolated incidents. We haven't seen like many lawsuits like this in the first place, and this is like two cases in like the only this year. We have not seen this before. But the thing with all of this is that you have to understand that the cases that we see are the cases that are serious enough and that both parties are confident enough to go to court over. Any case that ends before this point, we may never see or hear about it at all. Even if it doesn't happen to many of the individual firms, it does weigh on their minds as they try to go about developing something. Because even if as an indie you might think that something's original, it could be lying in the patent desk of a big company from like 16 years ago that they just thought of, put into paper, sent to the patent office, and just left there waiting. And just never saw light of day in the industry. So there is a lot of risk, and that I think can actually harm the industry's innovation quite a fair bit. And I'm not saying this just because like I hate Nintendo to the core of my bone or something. I do think that they do make very good games. And the thing is that it's not like I think that like, oh, Pocket Pair must win because the small guy must win against the big firm or something like that. No, looking at some of the things that have happened within the span since the original case till now, where it would seem that one of the original authors actually like had a mental breakdown and went on a rant and then deleted an entire series of tweets, actually claiming that they were actually like extremely mentally abused within the company. Like, if all of that were actually true, that actually paints a horrible image of the company itself. But once again, we don't know how much of that's actually true, because they actually did delete all of that the next day and then say that like, oh yeah, I didn't know what I was doing, so just ignore all of that. But I feel like we shouldn't let all of this like dislike for one company or the other like blind us to the fact that the precedents being set here is not a good one, and it's not a good trend for the industry overall, what both Sega and Nintendo are doing. And personally, I just find all of this fighting to be really stupid, because like this is all like money that could have been spent on like actually innovating and making good games. They're just basically going into legal departments to like file and fight patent cases instead. Like, you think about it, like the millions upon yen that these companies are earning in revenue from selling their games, they are just like being burnt on all of this like legal issues, instead of like actually going back to the developers to try and retain them and stay competitive with like foreign firms. Likely isn't helping their case, nor is it going to make the industry any more innovative. That said, I feel like I'm getting a little bit too heated with this. So that's all for today's video. As I mentioned, we will eventually I want to do a video at some point just doing a deep dive into patents and their impact on the industry as a whole. That will probably be for the future, but hopefully no other big case pops up between now and then, so that I can go back to the regularly scheduled videos, which hopefully will continue to be interesting to you guys. Needless to say, most videos aren't exactly like this, although this type of videos do pop up here and there, it does feel like. But that's it. I do hope you guys find this type of videos interesting as well. Maybe they might be a little more of a downer, so I do apologize for that. But it gives me a chance to talk a bit more about the industry as well. So hopefully there is some interesting takeaway from this video. Or although maybe it might have some level of overlap with the BOI Sega one. That said, if you did enjoy the video, do feel free to leave a like and maybe subscribe as well. Thank you to the very cool people here for helping to support the channel up until now. You're all very cool people for helping to make, well, I mean, maybe not so much videos like this, but the larger scale video series that I do, a thing that can be done in the first place. Usually I do more videos about, like, I guess at some point this type of video has also become like a decent part of the channel, but usually I do videos talking about like just like weeb events or doujin events within Japan, as well as like talking about console games as well. So if you're interested in any of that, or just me talking about like parts of the Japanese game industry, do feel free to subscribe. You might see more of all of these types of videos in the future. And if you want to support the channel, that is a thing that exists. I mean, not that, but like somewhere down there, there's a link to something that will allow you to do it. But that's it. Until next time, take care and bye.